Welcome. I'm Tara Lohan, Water Deeply's managing editor. And thanks for joining our conversation today about water and climate change in California. I'm joined today by Juliet Christian-Smith, who is a senior climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Max Gomberg, climate and conservation manager with the State Water Resources Control Board. Thank you both for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
So I just wanted to start first off with just a little bit of current events. We will shortly be having a president take office who denies climate science and has appointed a couple other climate deniers to some cabinet positions so far. Juliet, I want to start by asking you, as a climate scientist, how are you feeling right now, and what are some other folks in your community thinking?
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm really happy that you're doing this this hangout, and I'm really happy to be in California. It's been a difficult month or so, and this past week there was a big convening. It's the largest scientific conference in the United States. It's called the American Geophysical Union, and it was a great moment for scientists where we were all together sharing research and standing up for the value of science. So you might have seen there were protests. Governor Brown came and gave a talk where he said that climate scientists and science will persevere, that California is doubling down on its efforts to show the rest of the country and the world how you can cut emissions, address global warming, and have a thriving economy. So we've done that. The proof is in the pudding, and we're going to keep doing it. And so at the federal level, we face some real challenges, but we hope that the call to science and integrity and preserving our commitment to the country to those values will win out in the end. And so we actually put together a letter with over 2,000 scientists signing, over 20 Nobel laureates, asking the Trump administration to create rules around scientific integrity, so that even if the appointees don't understand the science, they can listen to the scientists who actually do the science and do understand it.
Thanks. Looks like we're getting a little bit of an echo. If we could all mute our microphones when we're not talking, that would be great. Hopefully that will go away. Max, from your perspective, what can the state be doing to help support climate science and scientists forward?
So the state, thankfully, is still maintaining its leadership role on responding to climate change. I mean, the state has been a leader on climate change issues since 2006 when AB 32 was passed. Last year we passed SB 32, which takes us even further down the path of trying to reduce emissions to a sustainable level that doesn't really endanger all of the planetary systems that would lead to really catastrophic effects, massive sea level rise, temperature change in ecosystems, and on and on. And so the good news is that the state, from the governor to our legislative leaders on down, is committed to continuing that leadership. The state has played a really critical role in the international negotiations leading to the Paris Agreement this last year. And there's a lot of work going on across the state on actions to continue both mitigation of climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from short-life climate pollutants like methane to carbon dioxide, to adapting to the changes we're already seeing, whether that's increased wildfires, drought, floods, increased temperatures, and the like. So there's a lot going on in California in the climate realm. That's going to continue no matter what happens in Washington, D.C.
Okay, since California now has the most ambitious greenhouse gas targets in the country, is there anything that anti-science action at the federal level could do to put that in jeopardy?
Certainly. In the past, the state has been granted waivers to essentially go above and beyond federal regulations. We've seen that with, for example, the fuel efficiency standards for vehicles, where California took the lead in setting higher fuel efficiency standards, and a number of other states followed. If there's federal action to try to roll back those allowances to the states, that could hamper some of our work. On the other hand, the ideological conservatives in Congress are fond of promulgating this idea that, well, the federal government should leave it to the states to decide. So they're going to find themselves in a quandary, and maybe that hypocrisy won't bother them, but if they try to do that.
Okay. All right. So taking a step back for a minute, Juliet, what do we actually know about California's climate in the past, and what should we be expecting in the future with climate change?
Well, we know that we're already experiencing climate change. It's not something that's going to happen later. It's happening now. Of course, it will get worse later. Already the statewide average temperature in the winter is more than 5 degrees warmer than it was historically. In addition, in 2015, for the first time ever in recorded history, temperatures in the Sierra Nevada were above freezing during the winter time. And that's a big problem if you have a large scale water system that is managing snowmelt primarily. So a third of our water comes from snowpack, and that melts into some of our major reservoirs that were created by the state and federal government in the 1950s. And those projects are seeing huge reductions in the amount of snow that they're getting. And also they're seeing big changes in the timing of snowmelt. So already we're seeing snowmelt, the peak of snowmelt events occurring about 30 days earlier than average. And that again it's a problem for management because the timing of water supply is out of phase with the timing of water demand. So basically we're widening the gap between water demand and water supply, and it's not there when we need it the most. So because of all of these problems with our traditional surface water, rivers, streams, lakes, reservoir, that system, because that system is failing us, we have seen a huge shift towards groundwater. And whereas groundwater usually supplies 30 to 50% of the water needs of Californians, over the last drought period, it's been supplying more than 60% of Californians' water needs. So as we see this shift, we're also seeing a lot of the undesirable results, a lot of negative impacts associated with groundwater use. And those include land subsidence, where land actually sinks due to the loss of water pressure underground, to seawater intrusion, salty water coming in along the coastlines, to just loss of public drinking water wells. So we had more than 2,000 public drinking water wells out over this past summer, and in some communities completely groundwater dependent, having to truck in water in schools, and major public health impacts.
Max, I know that the state is already working towards sustainability on groundwater. That's going to be, the law was passed in 2014, and implementation is beginning and will continue for quite some time. What else can water managers be doing besides relying on groundwater to help plan for less water coming, or water coming at a different time than they've previously been used to?
Well, they can do a lot of things, and in part it depends on who they're supplying. Are they supplying urban areas or agricultural operations? But generally, we still have a long way to go on efficiency in this state, and so there's a lot of technology that's in existence, new technology coming online, allowing us to be very efficient with every drop. And part of the reason that the governor issued the executive order he did last May was to ensure that we're moving towards a very highly efficient water use future across the state, urban areas, industry, ag as well. And so whether that's investing in sensing technology or more efficient appliances, irrigation systems, all of that, plus behavioral change in terms of the way we view our landscapes, what plants we use in the urban area, what crops are planted in different agricultural areas, and how they're irrigated, we can really gain a lot of water simply from more efficient practices, and that will enable us to become more resilient to the droughts ahead, which we know under climate change are going to be more severe.
Mhm. Is there anything that we need from an infrastructure point of view, whether that's reservoirs or smaller, more green infrastructure, stormwater? Would that help with both flooding and with drought?
Absolutely. There was a lot not to like in the federal Water Resources Development Act that the president just signed. But some of the money in there is for additional flood control projects. And that's important because on the other extreme from drought, we know that when it's wet from here on out, it's going to be very wet. And we may have some really extreme precipitation events with very powerful atmospheric rivers that dump a ton of rain and put us in danger of devastating floods. So we do need to continue investing in our flood management infrastructure. In terms of water supply, we really do need to store as much water in the ground when we have it as possible. So there's some innovative work going on. Now I'm looking about, can we use ag fields to let water percolate into the ground and replenish groundwater basins when that water is available? Can we inject more water? With reservoirs, we've built a lot of reservoirs in this state over the past century and a half. All the good spots are taken. So even if we do end up building another reservoir or two, it's not going to make a major difference in terms of increasing our ability to respond to climate change. Certainly with respect to stormwater and recycled water, we need to do more. We need to fund more. We need to make the regulatory pathways for doing more of that easier than they are now, and that's something we're working on.
Juliet, anything to add from that front from you?
Yeah, I'll just build on the point that Max was making about groundwater. We have more than 3 times the amount of storage underground as we do above ground in available storage right now. So, groundwater is a huge new area for us to think much more strategically about using to refill it in those wet periods, as Max mentioned, will be wetter, extremer precipitation, and to tap it in the dry periods that will be drier. But we haven't had any formal regulatory framework for groundwater until very recently. And the Union of Concerned Scientists and others were instrumental in helping to pass a package of bills that together are known as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014. And that act is the first to require statewide sustainable groundwater management plans. And right now at the local level, local entities are putting together groundwater sustainability agencies. Those have to be completed. They're new organizations that have to be completed by this summer. And then they'll immediately have to start putting together their plans. So their groundwater sustainability plans will be turned into the state. But the most important part is that if those plans don't look like they're going to actually achieve sustainability, or if they get off track from the plan, the state can step in. So it is a state enforcement mechanism that wasn't there in the past. And we're very hopeful that this will be taken very seriously and that the locals and the state will ensure that we do achieve sustainable groundwater management over time, because it's really our buffer to climate change impacts in California.
Yeah, and how do you think that things are going so far with the process of regulating groundwater? Are you getting feedback from areas that are finding it a difficult process?
I would say a lot of areas are finding it to be difficult. It's always difficult when you change something. People are pretty comfortable with the way things are working, and this will change the balance of power. So frankly, at the moment that we're at right now, there's a lot of focus just on the politics of setting up these new institutional structures called groundwater sustainability agencies. And we really need those governance structures to get it right. And I worked on a paper with some colleagues at UC's Wheeler Institute at the law school on putting together effective groundwater sustainability agencies and looking at a variety of metrics, from transparency to accountability to capacity, really making sure that these governance institutions are able to to do the science and do the monitoring that's necessary to really understand what sustainability means locally, and then have the staff, the technical capacity to implement plans to get them towards sustainability over time. So we will see in a few months how these agencies have been set up, but it's a difficult process.
Difficult, but necessary.
Yes.
Max, what are you seeing in terms of, we had mandatory conservation measures for water agencies, and then we switched now to the stress test. In terms of making sure that water agencies are, have a reliable supply for the near future, but also thinking long term, how do you as a regulator kind of bridge that gap and, have the short but long term picture as well?
Well, it means we're working twice as hard. We've been managing through this drought in every way possible, providing emergency drinking water supplies to communities that ran out of water, doing the emergency conservation regulations for the rest of the state, providing funding from Proposition 1, the water bond that was passed in 2014, for a number of critical infrastructure and conservation measures, as well as habitat restoration. And so we're going to continue to do that. At the same time, we're going to really focus on building the resilience, both on the demand side management, the water efficiency and conservation, which we will be coming out with our final report on in January. We just released the draft report and took comment on it through yesterday, as well as the supplies that we need to build more security into our water systems. So that's what we've talked about already: better groundwater management, additional stormwater capture and reuse, and more recycled water. And recycled water, of course, can be used just for irrigation, or it can be actually returned to the potable water system through advanced treatment. Right now, we do that in some parts of the state, where we advanced treat the recycled water, we put it back in a groundwater basin, and then a few months later we pull it back out and we put it back into the potable system. In San Diego, they're now putting it in a reservoir to be able to do that, and we're looking towards the future when we may not need to put it in a reservoir or a groundwater basin, but we may be able to treat it and put it right back into the potable distribution system, although that presents its own sets of risks and challenges that we have to work through.
Yeah. Do you think that, is there any additional work that the state should be doing in terms of investments in climate change adaptation, like sea level rise, or maybe ecosystem restoration projects in the Sierra? Anything on that front?
Absolutely. We have so much work that we could be doing on climate change adaptation. On the mitigation side, as you're aware, we have the state's cap and trade program, which creates emissions allowances and creates a pot of money which we can use to fund additional actions, whether it's public transit or other things to reduce emissions. On the adaptation side, we don't have the same type of funding source, but certainly we need to use the funds we have and potentially investigate ways to have new funds for everything from upper watershed ecosystem restoration to more green infrastructure to minimize flooding in urban areas, to managed retreat, because for our coastal areas, for non-critical infrastructure. There was a great article in the New York Times a couple months back about sea level rise in Florida, and it ended with one of the mayors basically saying, in the end, the ocean is going to win, and that's the truth. The only thing we can do is try to minimize the amount of sea level rise by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but no amount of infrastructure we can build is going to prevent sea level rise from really changing the character of our coastal zone. So we need to be proactive, and it's going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah, I would just add to that another key piece of adaptation is taking the information that we've already put together and applying it to our planning processes and our investment decisions. So this legislative session, we sponsored a successful bill called Climate Safe Infrastructure Bill, which was all about getting state engineers to talk to climate scientists who have been doing really groundbreaking work in California, so that we can understand impacts better, and take that information that they're developing and apply it to real world decisions around dams, bridges, highways, buildings. How do these design specifications need to change? And another example is working on the water bond. The very first drafts of the water bond, which will fund about $3 billion of new water infrastructure that could last through the century, over 100 years, did not include the words climate change. It didn't include any kind of climate science. So we were successful with the California Water Commission in getting climate change projections brought into the criteria that project applicants need to put together to say, this is a good project. If the public is going to spend money on this project, we can tell you how likely it is that we can provide these benefits in the future, because we know that we cannot use the past as a predictor of the future. That's the biggest problem with climate change and adaptation planning, is we're in uncharted territory. So we really need to use the scientific tools that we have, that the state has invested a lot of money in creating. We need to apply those to our real world management decisions.
What about on the wildfire front? I mean, it seems like in the last couple of decades we've had an increase in severity of wildfires in the Sierra, but at the same time we're also hearing, that fire suppression has been over the last 100 years not very helpful. We need to maybe change our relationship with fire, and learn to live more with fire. But of course, we also want to protect the ecosystem and communities. What do you see? How do we approach that front?
Well, it's a huge challenge. I mean, we've lost over 100 million trees since the drought started across the state, and we're going to lose millions more before things are over, because our forests have been ravaged by disease, drought, by fire, by pests, beetles, and the like. So it's dramatically reshaping some of those forest ecosystems. And as you say, the last century of policies to suppress wildfire has really allowed for those types of devastating fires, because the devastating fires happen when you have enough understory that when the fire starts, it can basically climb up into the canopy. And it's those canopy fires that really devastate the forest. And so we have a responsibility at the state level. The federal government, through the Forest Service and the Department of Interior, also has significant responsibility in this area as well, as a big land manager in California. And so we do need to work collaboratively on ways to protect the forest, to use managed burns where we can, and to enhance many of those upper elevation ecosystems, because that's critical for water supply as well. The more intact meadows we have up in the Sierras, the better water retention we get.
Juliet, anything else you want to add on that?
I think Max did a great job. There's a great research center at UC Merced that's doing a lot of this work on Sierra Nevada, and trying to understand how different management activities affect forest fires and water yield. And it's a very important piece of scientific research that's underway and has a lot of potential for helping us adapt to climate change. But again, some of the research shows that we're entering into a period where there will be much longer fire seasons, and some of this we need adaptation, and some of it simply will require very, very focused mitigation to deal with the higher temperatures that we're already experiencing and that are getting worse.
Yeah, we talked a little bit, about the environmental impacts here of climate change, but what are you seeing in terms of the social impacts of climate change and drought so far in California, and who are the people that are being affected and are most at risk even right now?
We've been doing work with the Community Water Center. They're located in Visalia, which is in the Tulare Lake Basin in the southern San Joaquin Valley. They're a community-based organization. They represent largely disadvantaged communities who are primarily groundwater dependent. So they have wells where they get their water for bathing and cooking. And they are some of the hardest hit by the drought because their wells, the domestic wells, are typically shallower than irrigation wells. So when there isn't water supplies from surface water systems, then agriculture typically shifts to groundwater, and that draws down the groundwater and leaves these folks with no potable water. And it's areas that have some of the lowest household incomes that are now paying very high prices for water that doesn't actually come out of their taps, and then replacement water, bottled water, and other supplies. It's really a human rights travesty, and the UN's special rapporteur came here and declared the Central Valley a human rights crisis due to the million plus residents in California that don't have access to clean drinking water.
Max, anything else to add?
Yeah, so just to give a preview, as Juliet mentioned, this really is a human rights travesty. And in California, California was the first state in 2012 to pass a bill titled the Human Right to Water, making it a policy of the state to provide affordable, safe, clean, and reliable drinking water to all of our residents. And we've made a lot of progress towards that goal, but we still have some critical funding gaps. And without divulging too much, I can tell you that it's going to be a very high priority for the administration in 2017 to try to close those gaps.
That's great. We have just 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you both one more question just to wrap up. Max, maybe we'll start with you. What do you think is the #1 priority that California should be focusing on in the next year when it comes to climate change and water?
Well, I really do think it's this issue we've just been talking about, because it is the most vulnerable communities that are most vulnerable to drought and water supply restrictions and reductions when droughts hit. And so we are really looking at all of the levers that we can pull at the state level, all the policy options available to us to close that gap, because it's an environmental justice issue, it's a climate change resilience issue, and it's a human rights issue. So that really, to me, is the top priority.
Juliet.
Am I next? Okay. I agree with Max. And I think that I'll tie in one other thread of our conversation, which is that in many of these areas, they are primarily dependent on groundwater for their drinking water supplies. And so right now, this year, they're setting up these new governance structures that will be a new entity that's really given a bunch of new authorities and is able to put basins on a path to more sustainable groundwater management, which means drinking water, which means prioritizing some of these community impacts and addressing them, if there is a seat at the table. And already what we're seeing is that the water world can be very insular, and in order for things to change, the people in the room have to change. And so when we're looking at the Tulare Lake Basin, where we're looking at the San Joaquin Valley, we want to make sure that these new governance structures include impacted communities, include disadvantaged communities, so that they can have a voice in the room, and they can talk about the real world impacts on them that the drought and climate change is causing, and they can help find solutions. Because otherwise, if it's the same people, they're probably going to come to the same conclusions. So I think the importance of governance and getting the institutions right can't be overstated.
Wonderful. Well, that is a great place for us to stop. Thank you both so much for joining us. Juliet Christian-Smith, the Union Concerned Scientist, Max Gomberg, the State Water Resources Control Board. We'll be publishing this also on waterdeeply.org. And thank you both for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.